Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to Mills Mills' Charities Get-Together for 2022 in-person and virtual edition. Thank you to everyone who was able to join us in person, as well as those who are able to join us online. We're so glad to have you with us here today. My name is Zach Silverberg. I'll be your MC for this afternoon, and I'm a litigator at Mills Mills. So I have a civil litigation practice based on employment law, state litigation, commercial litigation, and all sorts of litigation needs. Before we begin today's presentations with our wonderful speakers, I just want to acknowledge the land that we're meeting on today is a traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. For those of you who are with us virtually, we ask that you reflect on the history of the lands that you are on and the historical people of those lands. We have a great roster of speakers here for you today. First, we want to extend our thanks from Mills Mills for everyone who's attending. This event is very important to us, and we're so glad you're here. This annual event is an opportunity for us to bring our clients, our friends, and the charities and not-for-profits that we work with together for some networking, some education, and to learn about potential legal issues that are important to you and that you should be aware of and be knowledgeable about. While for the past 2 years we've been only virtual for this event, it's wonderful to be able to gather with some of you in person here today. In this beautiful location, we're so glad to be here. For those of us tuning in virtually, maybe next year, but we're also glad to have you virtually. The Charities Get-Together is one way that Mills Mills demonstrates its commitment to empowering our clients, educating the public, and exchanging ideas with our partners in the charities and not-for-profit sector. Mills Mills is celebrating its 138th year of service. This long-standing history of representing our clients in the not-for-profits and charities sector, as well as our corporate clients, is very important to us. We're very excited to continue to represent and help our clients with corporate governance, business growth, employment, litigation, and all their other legal needs. We're also able to specifically assist charities and not-for-profits with advising them on matters concerning estate administration and the litigious elements of being beneficiaries to donors' estates. We are proud to have a diverse roster of lawyers who are able to provide advice on all elements of estates and trust matters. As a full-service firm, we're also able to help our clients with real estate transactions, commercial litigation, trademark matters, and all matters of business law advice generally. 2 quick housekeeping matters before we get started with our speakers. First, each person who's in attendance here today personally was entered into a door prize raffle. The winners of the door prizes will be announced at the end of the presentation, which means you got to stick around. This year, the door prizes are a basket of chocolate and champagne, a gift certificate to Toroni, and 2 tickets to an upcoming Raptors game. Second, for those of us who are watching online, in the event that anyone has any technical difficulties with the live stream, 2 emails will be inputted into chat so that you can email us at. These emails will be available to you if you have any issues. If you'd like to ask a question, someone will be monitoring the chat function and we'll be able to ask questions on your behalf at the end of the presentation. We'll be hearing from 2 of my associates in Mills Mills today, Adnan Subzwari and Tanya Kuzman. Adnan will be speaking about protecting your charity's reputation in the social media age. Tanya will be discussing the highlights from Canada's Budget 2022, what your charity needs to know. We will have a Q&A after both of them have spoken, so hold your questions until the end, please. So introducing Adnan first. Adnan joined Mills Mills in 2022 and we worked together on a broad range of issues. I'm very lucky to have him as a colleague. He's been a great addition to our team, bringing a wealth of knowledge, and he's practical. Costs are important and we want to make sure that we provide cost-effective representation to our clients. Please join me in welcoming Adnan.
Thank you very much. And as Zach was saying, I am an associate at Mills Mills, and I joined in June. It's been a pleasure to have joined the firm and to work with Zach and the rest of the litigation team. I have a broad litigation practice, one of which is defamation. and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. But I am a lawyer, so I would be remiss if I did not begin my presentation with a disclaimer. I begin all of my conversations with a disclaimer that I am not providing legal advice, that I'm providing legal information, and if you require specific legal advice to your specific situation, then you should retain a lawyer and have you assist you with that. So today we're going to be talking about a few things. We're going to be talking about the value of reputations. Why is your reputation something that is worth protecting? We're going to be talking in particular about the threat that defamation poses to your reputation. We're going to talk about how reputation and defamation intersect in the social media age. How has the advent of Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn affected your reputations? And we're going to talk about how you protect your reputation. How can you preempt threats? How can you minimize damages? And when the worst happens and someone is attacking your reputation online, what can you do to protect yourself? And finally, we'll have questions, but it'll be a joint question session later. So, starting with the value of reputations. Well, reputation has a fairly simple definition. It's simply the opinions that people hold, or people or society generally hold about someone or something. Really, a reputation is what other people think about you. But we all know that reputations are much more than that. They are the currency on which we trade our business. They're the value that we give to our brand. We all know because everyone in this room has traded on their reputation. I trade on my reputation every time I'm dealing with a client, every time I am talking to opposing lawyers on the other side, every time I stand before a judge in court advocating for my clients. I am trading on the reputation that I have built case on case, brick by brick. And all of you have done that. You know that it's taken years to build that reputation. But we also know that reputation is very easily lost, and it is very difficult to recover. One misstep can undo years of hard work. And to emphasize the importance of reputations, I have a quote from you from someone who certainly has a reputation. That's Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett said, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently." So, how does defamation play into all of this? Well, defamation is a particular concern for reputations because when you're being defamed, it's often being done through someone's malice, right? People who engage in defamation, they often don't have any monetary incentive. You know, they just want to bring you down. And that is damaging, that is pernicious. Now, in a legal sense, defamation is whenever someone says something that lowers your reputation in the eyes of others. That's a pretty broad concept, but our courts have held that it applies to both individuals and organizations, because organizations like corporations, not-for-profits, charities, they all have reputations that are worth protecting. And it's not just restricted to public pronouncements. If you say something to a group of people and that lowers your reputation in the eyes of others, it can be defamatory. Now, you may have heard about phrases like libel and slander, and those are both subsets of defamation. And simply put, when it's written, it's libel, and when it's spoken, it's slander. So if someone was outside in the parking lot with a megaphone and saying defamatory words, that would be slander. But if they were handing out pamphlets with those defamatory words, that would be libel. Now, the people who defame others, they can rely on certain defenses. So the most common defenses are truth. Whatever I was saying is true, so that's fine. Or fair comment, which is basically, well, it's my opinion. Although under Canadian law, the fair comment that you make has to be tethered to factual reality. It cannot be something completely made up. And of course, there's reportage or reportage, and that's basically reporting that something happened. And that's often used by newspapers when they're publishing something. Say, well, this is just what we're reporting, and you'll often see the line that, well, the case is before the courts, and these are only allegations that have not been proven. And they're protecting themselves, and they're relying upon the reportage defense. So how does that play into the social media age? Well, before I talk about the negatives, I don't want to completely downplay the positives of social media. We know that social media has connected us with each other and the world like never before. We know that it's allowed us to spread our message wider than ever to a national and global audience in a blink of an eye. We know that it assists us in bringing change quickly and efficiently. Governments have been brought down on Twitter. But with all of those pros, there are cons. And the first is that anyone can post anything, and it lasts forever. You know, one of the downsides of social media is that someone can post a completely defamatory diatribe, but it's presented professionally in beautiful typeface on a platform, and it lends that defamatory word a credibility that it does not deserve. People think that it's legitimate. There is also the problem that bad content can go viral, and it can become almost impossible to manage. And this can happen even when whatever is being said is completely untrue. So just to give you an example, back in 2020 in the US, they had a somewhat contested election, and one of the companies that was involved, Dominion Voting, people on Twitter were saying all sorts of things about Dominion, things that were completely untrue, and it was later proven to be untrue. But it was on Twitter, it was on Facebook, it was on Instagram, and it stayed. Now, Dominion ultimately sued for defamation, and that matter is going through the courts, but their reputation has been harmed nevertheless. Every time people think about Dominion, what they think about is not about the cutting-edge technology and the ways that they've given access to voting to people. They think about the allegations. And perhaps most perniciously, these days there are companies that certain people can hire to post bad content on social media. They'll set up what are called bots or computers that create multiple accounts. And these fake accounts, their whole sort of function is to just inundate your organization or yourself with bad content in the hopes that something will go viral and it'll ruin your reputation. So, how do you protect yourself against that? As you can see, I've broken things down in green, yellow, and red. And this sort of lays out sort of the severity of the action that you need to take based on the threat that is posed. At the green stage, you can do things preemptively to protect yourself and your reputation on social media. So one thing that you can do, and not many people actually do this, is that just keep searching your name on Google, search social media for your mentions, and just keep an eye on what people are saying about you on the internet. You can also see who is following you. Try to see if they're real people or if they're bots. Oftentimes bots will have generic accounts and there's not much content. And if there are bots, then you might want to preemptively remove them from following you. A lot of social media companies also have community rules. And if somebody is violating those community rules, you can report them. Now, there's some controversy about the efficacy of these rules, but they exist and you should certainly try to use them. But if that fails, and if there is someone who is saying harmful things about you online, we can go to the next step, which is trying to prevent or contain the damage and sort of try to nip it in the bud before it becomes a real problem. And at this stage, you may want to hire a lawyer. And as a lawyer, someone can send a cease and desist letter. So this is really just a letter telling the individual to stop doing what they're doing, or else they will face civil proceedings. We can also send demands to social media companies to unmask anonymous users. Tell what emails they use to sign up. Now, this can have mixed results because social media companies rightfully are torn between protecting their users' privacy with the very real concerns that they have about their platform being used for defamatory purposes. But it's worth a shot anyway. And then we can help you retain companies that specialize in removing harmful comments. Now, this is most helpful if it's Google or Google reviews and someone's posting a lot of bad Google reviews about you. They can't be removed, but these companies specialize in upvoting or bringing up positive comments so that the negative material is effectively suppressed. But if that doesn't work, and if someone is really focused on harming your reputation, then you move to the red stage and you try to protect yourself from further harm. And here you may want to commence defamation proceedings. As part of defamation proceedings, we can go to court and we can seek a judge's order that the material is removed. We can do this fairly early on. We can get what is called an interim or interlocutory injunction, which is that even before the case is heard finally, we can go to a judge and say, well, you should remove this material for the time being because of how harmful it is to you. Most civil proceedings don't go to trial. So once a proceeding is commenced, that gives us tremendous leverage to negotiate with the individuals and try and see if we can get monetary payment for damages or an apology. There was a fairly famous instance of this in Canada. It was about 3 years ago. Patrick Brown, who at the time was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, he had certain stories circulate in the news about him. And there were some material inaccuracies in those reportings. And he sued CTV for defamation. He sued Bell Media as well for defamation. The lawsuit didn't go to trial. It settled. And as part of the settlement, CTV published a public apology on their website and on their main news show about Patrick Brown. Now, of course, some of the damage was done, but the apology went a long way in helping him rehabilitate his reputation, and I understand that he was recently re-elected as mayor of Brampton. So these are some of the things that you can do to protect your reputation. Now, you may be asking, well, how can I help with all of this? Well, as a lawyer, we can certainly serve cease and desist letters. This is one of the first things that we do, and it's a very cost-effective way to try and resolve a dispute even before having to go to court. If it's libel, we can also serve them with what is called a libel notice, which is a court document. and formally puts them on notice that if they do not remove the content, if they do not apologize, then civil proceedings will be initiated. And if that doesn't work, we can certainly commence defamation proceedings. And in fact, I've got several going right now against certain bad actors. We can defend against SLAPP proceedings. Now, this is an interesting thing that's developed in recent years. SLAPP stands for Strategic Lawsuits Against Public Participation. And it's really lawsuits commenced by wealthy individuals or corporations against people legitimately speaking about things in the public interest. Whistleblowers, not-for-profits, charities, talking about things that matter. And defamation proceedings here are not used to shield someone from and protect their reputation, but rather as a sword to clamp down on free speech. And in Ontario and in British Columbia and in many other Canadian provinces, there is now legislation that allows us to deal with SLAPP proceedings by having those proceedings dismissed at a very early stage, and oftentimes you are reimbursed fully for your legal costs. So all of your legal costs are reimbursed by the court. So that's a good development against defamation lawsuits that were being used for the wrong purpose. And as we talked about, we can go to court for orders to prevent defamation, reveal the identities of perpetrators. We can get court orders for that as well. And finally, there's always the prospect of negotiating settlements. And as I said, in most cases, that is indeed what ends up happening. So this is just a very brief sort of overview of reputations in the social media age, the particular threat of defamation. And you might be thinking, well, it's not likely that anyone's going to defame me, or I don't want to find myself ever in that situation. But the reality is that the threat exists. Social media has made that threat much more pronounced. And if you do find yourself in a situation where someone is defaming you online, it's good to have information available to know what your next steps are, what you can do by yourself, and when do you need a lawyer, and how that lawyer can help you protect your reputation. So thank you very much. We're saving questions until later, and I hope you continue to enjoy your lunch. Thank you.
One more round of applause for Adnan. Thank you so much, Adnan. All right, next up we have our second speaker. We have Tanya coming up. Tanya is a member of our business law group and our not-for-profit law group. She assists charities and not-for-profits and private companies as well, dealing with commercial matters of all sorts. She helps with incorporations, corporate reorganizations, charitable registrations, dissolution, and general commercial services. We are very lucky that Tanya started her legal career with the firm back in 2017 as a student, and we've kept her ever since. Tanya has worked with all three levels of government, including the City of Toronto, the Province of Ontario, and the House of Commons in Ottawa, and she brings her knowledge of the public sector to her private sector clients as well. Tanya will be telling us today about Canada's 2022 budget and what charities need to know. So please join me in welcoming Tanya to the stage.
So I'm just going to get started by letting you know that I am also a lawyer. And as was mentioned by my wonderful colleague Adnan, this is legal information and not legal advice. So to the extent that you do require some more specific legal advice, we'd be happy to give it. Just give us a call. So we are going to go over just a quick snapshot of what I'm going to cover today. And that is going to be Oh, thank you very much, Taras. I'm going to give a very brief introduction about the budget, and then the majority of this presentation is really going to focus on the new qualifying disbursement regime, which is really just a new way for charities to work with non-qualified donees. And if none of those words mean anything to anybody right now, I promise they will by the end of the presentation. And then I'm going to focus on a very brief note, emphasis on the new proposed disbursement quotas for charities which came out of the budget, and then we will deal with questions. So we have a lot to cover and not a lot of time to cover it. So I'm going to start by talking about the budget. So in June of this year, the Budget Implementation Act did pass, and so this should be no surprise to anybody. You know, each year the federal government proposes a budget to the public, and it essentially tells us where all of our tax dollars are being spent. But aside from the hard numbers, it really is in many ways a pretty significant policy statement coming out of the federal government's office and the Department of Finance, which is really telling the public, you know, what the government values, what we should be supporting, and its expectations for how various sectors of the economy are going to perform. So out of Budget 2022 came many developments for the charitable sector, two of which have really been the talk of the town. And so the first of those would be the new qualifying disbursement regime. And the second was a proposed change to charities' disbursement quotas. So it's pretty clear that the word disbursements is going to be a frequent flyer today. So I just want to start off by making it really clear that qualifying disbursements are in fact different from disbursement quotas, which we will address later. Okay, so we're going to jump right in to talk about the new qualifying disbursement regime. But before we do that, I just want to start off by making a pretty fundamental distinction really clear. So the charity world is essentially divided into two large groups, okay? So we have qualified donees and non-qualified donees. A qualified donee is an organization that can issue official donation tax receipts for gifts that it receives from individuals and corporations. So this is the coveted tax receipt that everybody here would be familiar with. So examples of qualified donees are registered charities like yourselves, a registered Canadian Amateur Athletic Association. The UN is a qualified donee, and there are many other examples on the CRA's website. And the other half of this world is our non-qualified donees, which is essentially everything and everyone that isn't a qualified donee. And it's no surprise that non-qualified donees are not qualified to issue official donation tax receipts. Okay, so why is this important, and why am I focusing on this distinction? Well, the reason is because the CRA imposes a great deal of restrictions on charities who wish to work through and with non-qualified donees to carry out their own charitable activities and furtherance of their charitable purposes. And that really sits at the heart of the new qualifying disbursement regime and what we're going to talk about today. So I do think this distinction is really important to just establish at the outset. So I want to talk about the new qualifying disbursement regime, but to understand the new regime, we should probably take a look at how things functioned under the old system, or pre-budget 2022. Okay, so prior to the budget, the Income Tax Act only allowed a charity to really operate or use its resources in two ways. And I think it will be helpful for everybody to really think about this from the perspective of restrictions and permissions on the ways that charities can use their resources to conduct their own charitable activities and furtherance of their purposes. So pre-budget 22, we've got these two main ways that charities can use their resources, and that is carrying on their own charitable activities and making gifts to qualified donees. So we're going to tackle each of these briefly. So this is so familiar to this room, I'm sure. So carrying on your own charitable activities, there are two main ways that this can happen. The first is through your charity's own staff. So your own volunteers, your own employees, your own folks, right? So if you're a charity with a purpose of the relief of poverty, for example, and you are operating a food bank, you're likely going to have your own volunteers, your own employees operating this food bank, and you are in effect conducting your own charitable activities through your own folks, right? The other big way is by carrying on charitable activities through what's called an intermediary. So an intermediary is a non-qualified donee that is separate from the charity. What and why would a charity ever want to work with a non-qualified donee? Well, typically, intermediaries are going to probably provide the charity with resources that the charity needs, such as a particular set of skills, a knowledge base, or some sort of specialized equipment that the charity's own folks can't provide themselves. So let's take, for example, a charity that has as its purpose the promotion of health. And let's say that its main activity is going to be providing mental health counseling to underserviced communities across Canada. In that example, if nobody in the charity is qualified to provide the mental health counseling, then likely that charity is going to be looking for intermediaries to help them conduct their own charitable activities. In this case, a good example would be finding psychologists throughout Ontario or Canada that can provide those services. So here we have an example of a charity that's conducting its own charitable activities through these intermediaries, which are non-qualified donees. So the big caveat to all of this is that where a charity decided to actually conduct its own activities through an intermediary, which is a non-qualified donee separate from the charity, there was this huge obligation, which continues to be the case, of direction and control over the resources that you are sharing or using with this non-qualified donee or this intermediary. And direction and control, the test of direction and control has often been viewed by, hello new guests, have often been viewed by the charitable sector as a little bit burdensome, right? It usually requires some sort of intense agreement between the charity and the intermediary that really makes it clear, to put it simply, that the charity calls the shots, right? Like, we have direction and control over where the resources are going and how they are being spent. And so, so that's sort of the point, frankly, is that, prior to Budget 2022, this was the main way that charities could actually work with a non-qualified donee, conducting their own activities through an intermediary with direction and control. And so what we've covered so far is really the first way that charities were able to use their resources prior to Budget 2022, and that is to carry out their own activities through their own folks, or to carry out their own activities through an intermediary. The second way that charities are permitted to use their resources is by making gifts to qualified donees, right? So this is actually quite simple comparatively. It's where a charity will transfer a certain percentage of their resources, gifts of money or property, to another qualified donee, like another charity, and then the gift is used to carry out activities that further your original charity's purposes. So it doesn't have to be a check, could be sort of property, supplies, equipment, for example. So, to summarize kind of what we've been talking about and what I've mentioned so far, is we've really gone over the permitted use of resources under the old regime or pre-budget 2022. And the point really here is that, as you can see on the slide, if you're a Canadian registered charity, you can use your resources to conduct your own activities through your own employees or volunteers, or through a structured arrangement with an intermediary with direction and control, where you can give gifts to qualified donees. And now is the exciting part, where we get to talk about how things have changed since Budget 2022 came into effect. Okay, so here we go. Well, this is the new system. And you might notice on this slide that one of these things does not look like the other. There's a big tomato in the middle of this slide. But before we address the big red circle on the slide, you'll notice that the right side of this slide has not changed, right? We've got, oh, I see that the word own activities is barely readable. Can folks read own activities? Can you see that? No? Okay, so the right-hand square really should say own activities, and the charity is able to use its resources to conduct its own activities through its employees and volunteers, or, as we've gone over, a structured arrangement with an intermediary using direction and control. The other side of the slide has changed, right? Where we see now this new option of qualifying disbursements. And it appears that as a result of Budget 2022, charities now have this new option to make what are called qualifying disbursements to non-qualified donees, which are called grantee organizations. And incidentally, as a result of Budget 2022's changes, gifts to qualified donees, which was always allowed, are now just being classified as another type of qualifying disbursement. So this is not really a big deal. It's more of like a terminology change. The main focus here is the fact that charities now have this option to make qualifying disbursements to, or grants to grantee organizations, which are essentially non-qualified donees. But let's really dig into what this actually means. So, and before I do that, I just want to give the caveat that what we are presenting here is our best representation of what we know so far. The Canada Revenue Agency has not released any interpretation of these rules yet. We don't really have a lot of knowledge or information on the specific requirements that will accompany making qualifying disbursements. So what we're presenting today is our best representation of what we know so far. Okay, so what is a grantee? What is a grantee organization? Well, a grantee organization is a person, club, society, association, prescribed entity. It's not a qualified donee. So the point is that you can make a qualifying disbursement to a non-qualified donee. That's what we know so far. And if you wanted to take advantage of this new regime or make use of it, shall we say, how would you do that? What would be required? Well, the first thing is that the disbursement that you make really has to be in furtherance of a charitable purpose of your charity. So what does this mean? It means what it means is you can't go around willy-nilly making qualifying disbursements to random not-for-profits that are conducting activities that don't actually further your own charity's charitable purposes. So that's the first big criteria. The second is that the charity is supposed to quote-unquote ensure that the disbursement is being exclusively applied to charitable activities that are in furtherance of the charitable purposes of your charity, okay? So we'll back up and talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And the third criteria is that the charity has to maintain documentation, which is sufficient to demonstrate these first two things. The first being that, you know, the purpose for which the disbursement was made, and secondly, again, that those funds, that disbursement is being used exclusively to be used for activities in furtherance of charitable purpose of your original charity. So if we look at the second criteria, you know, your charity has to ensure that the disbursement is exclusively applied to charitable activities in furtherance of purposes of your charity. What does this really mean, right? It's been the subject of much discussion amongst the charities bar, right? Because without further guidance from the Canada Revenue Agency, does ensuring mean that there needs to be an agreement in place? Does it mean more? Do you have to monitor? Do you have to have regular reports, phone calls, photographic evidence, videos? Who knows? What's pretty clear is that you can't have a 10-minute chat with a not-for-profit and then about a potential qualifying disbursement and then cut them a check, right? There's going to need to be, for sure, some written documentation in place, and you could probably bet your bottom dollar that there are going to be some obligations associated with making this type of a qualifying disbursement if you want to partner with a non-qualified donee in this way. And again, all subject to CRA guidance, right? Isn't that super fun? So a lot of information in a very short period of time. So let's take a big step back and ask ourselves, what has really changed here? Like, what's the big difference and why should we care? The main difference and the main thing that Budget 2022 changes in respect to these qualifying disbursements is essentially that charities have been given a new way to work with non-qualified donees other than the existing regime with intermediaries and the direction and control system. So this is really interesting, right? Because this is ostensibly supposed to be a less burdensome option than working through the intermediary direction and control system. And a lot of folks have said that this is going to be a way to facilitate partnerships, more partnerships between charities and non-qualified donees. So, I mean, again, the question is really up for debate because depending on what's required to ensure that these resources are being used for charitable activities, the point is that we don't really know if it's less burdensome or not, but it's a new option and there's hope on the horizon for new opportunities for partnerships, okay? So again, all subject to CRA guidance. And I just want to be really clear, you can tell on the left-hand side of this slide that the existing regime is still an option, right? So if you are a charity working through an intermediary right now and that system works for you and you've got direction and control, way to go. You don't have to change anything. Okay, so with any new rule and with any new opportunity comes another chance that you could mess up and your charitable status could be revoked. Yay! Obviously, I'm kidding. But so the government has brought in, as a result of these new rules, some new anti-avoidance measures. And so here's what you need to know. Under the new rules, meaning these new qualifying disbursement rules, charities are prohibited from accepting gifts that are expressly or implicitly conditional on making a gift to a person that's other than a qualified donee. So, I mean, put simply, what this means is, if you are a charity, you can't really accept a gift from a donor where they expressly are telling you and you are acknowledging, hey, by the way, we know this is going to X non-qualified donee, and you accept it and you both are on the same page that that's really where the money's ultimately headed. Similarly, even if it's not expressly stated, we both know this money is going to X qualified donee, you're not really permitted to end up in a wink, wink, nudge, nudge situation either. Like, here's some donation for you, and wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we both know implicitly it's headed to a non-qualified donee. All of your fundraising efforts and any donations you take in need to continue to be for your organization and in furtherance of your activities and purposes. And then you as an organization can make a decision about whether or not it makes sense to make one of these qualifying disbursements to a non-qualified donee, which is called a grantee organization. Isn't terminology so great? So many terms we have to learn. Okay, so last but not least, reports. Your T3010 is going to, your annual information return is going to need to reflect any qualifying disbursements that you've made. So 3 main things you'll have to report that we know so far from CRA is the name of each grantee organization that received more than $5,000 in qualifying disbursements in the year, the purpose of each of the disbursements, and the total amount dispersed to each grantee organization in the year. So notwithstanding these are the bare minimum recommendations, obviously I would suggest, particularly because this regime requires a lot of record keeping, that you just keep records of all of your qualifying disbursements, make sure it's clear. This is sort of, I think, the bare minimum for the T3010. Okay. So that brings me to the end of my part of the presentation that's dealing with the new qualifying disbursements regime. And I hope everybody is still with me. It looks like everyone's still looking my way, so that's a good sign. And I'm going to just move on to a very brief note, emphasis on brief, of the new proposed disbursement quotas for charities. So please keep in mind, this isn't in effect yet. These are proposed changes, and so the current disbursement quota regime remains in place. But before we get into all of that, let's just go over the basics. So disbursement quota is the minimum calculated amount that a registered charity is required to spend each year on its own charitable programs or on gifts to qualified donees. So some things that we went over earlier. So this is probably not new for anybody. The disbursement quota calculation is based on a couple of things, but mostly the value of the charity's property that's actually not used in carrying out your charitable activities or furthering your charitable purposes. So some good examples would be if your charity holds shares in the capital of a for-profit corporation or has a property that's sitting somewhere empty as an investment. The value of these things are ultimately the unused property upon which the percentage will be calculated. So, and for the purposes of the presentation, I'm just going to call that unused property, okay? So these are the current disbursement quotas. So they're a bit different right now, depending on whether you're a charitable organization or a foundation. If you're a charitable organization, where the average of your unused property is greater than $100,000, then your disbursement quota is 3.5%. And if you are a foundation, the threshold is a little bit lower. The value of your unused property is greater than $25,000. Your disbursement quota is also 3.5%. But the difference between the two is the threshold. These are the new proposed rules effective January 2023. an increase of the disbursement quota for charities with assets over $1 million. So this is unlikely to affect a vast majority of charities, right? It's going to affect a very small amount of charities that have assets over $1 million. And what it really boils down to is that charities with unused property over $1 million at any time in the 24 months immediately preceding the taxation year must disperse a couple of things. A minimum amount of funds equal to $35,000. This is a little bit of math here, bear with me. 3.5% of the initial $1 million plus 5% of the portion of unused property that's over $1 million, okay? So, I mean, look, first of all, yeah, this is a change. It'll affect some charities. If you're captured by this, take a look at your situation and see if there are ways that you can plan for this to come into effect. Of course, we're happy to help with that. And keep in mind also that all amounts that a charity is spending on its charitable activities throughout the year is always going to go towards meeting your disbursement quota. This isn't anything in addition. Everything you spend is going towards your disbursement quota on a rolling basis. The point in raising this here for you is just to flag it as something you need to be aware of in the event you're captured by the new proposed rules, okay? So obviously it's something that will require a second look if it does affect you. And with that, that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I hope you're all still with me and that it was useful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tanya. You can stay up here. We can put that away and then come on back. I'd like to welcome Adnan back as well. Why don't we have one more round of applause for both of our wonderful speakers. Thank you both so much. And we now have an opportunity for questions from both those online as well as from the crowd here today. So the question is for online defamation or slander, particularly on social media, is it better to address it immediately on that social media place, or is it better to deal with it otherwise? And Adnan can answer that.
Thank you. Well, that's a great question, thanks. And it does create a conundrum because the instinctive reaction is to immediately defend yourself and post a rebuttal. But the problem is that if someone has posted something like that, they'll probably reply and they'll dig deeper and they might say something even more harmful. And so in those situations, if they have said something that's just completely defamatory, I think, and of course it depends on the situation, but generally you may want to go through the process and first maybe report the comment, see if Twitter or Facebook or Instagram takes it down by themselves, or send a letter. Normally with these bad actors, if they feel confident enough to post something online, I'm sure that they will love to get your reaction. They just feed off of it, right? So, thank you.
Thanks, Adnan. We had another question in the back. Go ahead, sir.
Also, in regards to the, which you were saying earlier, bad publicity. Some people say good publicity, bad publicity is good for business.
So the question is all publicity good publicity?
Well, I think that if you're in a professional environment, I don't think that applies, because fundamentally, especially if you're a charity, or a not-for-profit organization, or even a lawyer, you're asking people to trust you, right? They're asking people to put their faith in you. And if you have a lot of bad publicity, sure, you will be notorious. But will people want to put their trust in you? I'm not sure. But, it can change on the situation. So if, for example, you were a celebrity with a reality TV show, perhaps bad publicity is good publicity. But I think in a professional setting, we want good publicity. Thanks.
Great. Question from the middle.
For Tanya, on with respect to new or giving to non-qualified donees, what about a Canadian registered charity making a donation to a foreign charity that is registered in a foreign jurisdiction?
So can a Canadian charity make a donation to a foreign registered charity? And then would that qualify under the non-qualified donee statute?
Yeah.
Tanya.
So the short answer is that it would appear the answer is yes, from what we know right now. So we know that a grantee organization has a pretty broad definition as being entities that are not qualified donees. So that would certainly suggest to me that a non-qualified donee, a not-for-profit that's abroad, may in fact be an option. But of course, charities do need to maintain a great deal of care and attention in not becoming a conduit, and certainly prevent the misuse of charitable resources. So in any time that a charitable organization is making one of these new qualifying disbursements, if it is abroad or anywhere, one still needs to satisfy that second pretty intense criteria that you have to ensure where the funds are going and that they're being applied exclusively to charitable activities in furtherance of your original charity's charitable purposes. So the short answer is yes, but with a whole lot of caveats backed up onto it.
Good answer. We should probably have the disclaimer up on the.
Yeah.
Anyone else from the room? We have one from online. The question online is, what is the difference between working with an intermediary and making payments to non-qualifying donees?
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Charlene. Okay, so question, the difference between making a qualifying disbursement to a grantee organization, which is a non-qualified donee, or your charity conducting its own activities through an intermediary is fundamentally that when a charity is working through an intermediary using direction and control, they are essentially conducting their own charitable activities through the intermediary. Remember, the only reason a charity will usually work through an intermediary is because the folks within the charity, their own staff, their own volunteers, their own employees are not able to provide something that the charity needs. So for example, if we have a charity that wants to promote education by building schools abroad in Guatemala, for example, I have a great client that does that. They would be working with a contractor, for example, in Guatemala to build the school. But essentially, the charity is conducting its own charitable activities. When you make a qualifying disbursement to a grantee organization, it seems that while the funds need to be used in furtherance of activities that actually further your charitable purposes, the charity isn't necessarily conducting its own activities in that example. In fact, the non-qualified donee, in this case the grantee organization, is carrying out some sort of activities, but that those activities should ultimately further your charity's charitable purposes. So there needs to be some connection to your charity's charitable purposes, but you're not necessarily carrying out your own activities in that case. With an intermediary, you absolutely are. The intermediary is helping the charity conduct its own activities through the intermediary. So I hope that clears up the difference.
Great answer. You're the expert, not me on this. I'm just a litigator, but any other questions from the room or from online? I have one more for Adnan. If someone brings a lawsuit against you for defamation, even though it's clearly without merit, and you mentioned something about slap suits, and sounds like it's one of them. Can you tell me a little bit more about kind of how it works? How do you get that lawsuit dismissed at an early stage, and what does that look like?
Yeah, thanks, Zach. It's a very interesting development, and the function of anti-SLAPP legislation is really to act as a gatekeeper against these lawsuits. So if someone brings a defamation proceeding against you to just shut you down, then what we can do is we can bring a motion to have it dismissed. And it usually requires some sworn evidence. If we bring a motion, all we have to show is that whatever you said was in the public interest. It's a fairly broad definition. Once that's done, the ball is in the other side's court. and they will have to show that their case has substantial merit. So not just an arguable case, but substantial merit, and that none of the defenses to defamation apply. That's a pretty high bar. And if they lose, they get to pay all of your legal costs. There was a fairly famous instance of a slap motion, and this was when CBC Marketplace ran a news story on Subway sandwiches and whether there's an agent in their bread that's made from yoga mats. And Subway sued CBC for defamation. CBC brought a slap motion. They were successful. And I believe the legal costs that Subway was on the hook for was somewhere in the vicinity of $700,000 for that. So it's a pretty powerful tool if you need to use it.
So I guess the lesson is when you're suing someone, be sure you're right. Any other questions from online or in person? Seeing and hearing none, I would love to welcome up our esteemed partner, Paul Mills. He is a member of our Wills and Estates group, and he has some closing remarks for us today.
Well, thank you all for being here, and for those who are attending online. It's a privilege to host these events, and hopefully you have learned something. I'm a simple estates lawyer, and I've certainly learned something today from my colleagues, and I thank you for that. It's a treat to have you here and to see some familiar faces, to meet some new faces. We are privileged to do work for some of you and would be pleased to do work for all of you. But it's very great pleasure to welcome you and to say thank you for coming. And I'll introduce my partner, Denise Robertson.
Okay, well, I agree with Paul. Thank you so much for everybody attending today, online, in person. Thank you to Adnan, to Tanya for excellent speaking engagements here for us today. I really appreciate all of that. And not only to our speakers, I also want to thank Zach, our host, and to Richard Worsfold, Taras Kulish, who helped to organize this event. I really do appreciate all your support and help with that. All right, now to the moment everybody has been waiting for. We've got these 3 door prizes. So first we're going to draw for a gift certificate to Tironi. Paul, you do the honors. All right, we have Nikki Davenport. Okay, all right. Here, we can give that to Nikki. Okay, and next we're going to draw for chocolate and sparkling wine.
Ooh. Is this one or 2?
I think it's just one.
There you go.
Melanie Brooks. Yes. And then lastly, we have 2 tickets to the Raptors versus Cleveland Cavaliers at the end of the month, November 28th. So. And we've got Adrian Brooks. There you go. Lucky with the Brooks today. There you are. And Richard Williams. Okay, and with that, we have now concluded the formal part of the event today. So I do encourage those in person to stay around, network a little bit. We have a reception, and thank you to everybody attending online.